Chapter 7. I have a complaint, Quillerin told Arch at the press club on Wednesday night. I know what it is. Your name was spelled with a U yesterday, but we caught it in the second edition. You know what's going to happen, don't you? The next time the Typographers Union meets with management, the spelling of your name is going to be one of their grievances. I have another beef, too. I wasn't hired to be an orderly for your art critic, but that's what he seems to think. Do you know he's leaving town tonight? I guessed as much, said Arch. That last batch of tapes included enough copy for 3 columns. First, I delivered those tapes for him. And then I picked up his ticket for the 3 o'clock plane this afternoon. And now, I'm expected to do latrine duty for his cat. Wait till Odd Bunsen hears this. Don't tell him. Nosy Bunsen will find out soon enough in his own devious way. I'm supposed to feed the cat twice a day, change his drinking water, and attend to his commode. Do you know what a commode is? I can guess. It was new to me. I thought cats just ran out in the backyard. There's nothing in the guild contract about reporters doing toity service, Arch said. Why didn't you decline? Mount Clemens didn't give me a chance. He's a sly operator. There I was, sitting in his kitchen, mesmerized by fresh pineapple, boiled chicken livers, and eggs and sour cream. It was female pineapple, what's more. What could I do? You'll have to choose between pride and gluttony, that's all. Don't you like cats? Sure, I like animals. And this cat is more human than a few people I could name. But he gives me the uncomfortable feeling that he knows more than I do. And he's not telling what it is. Arch said, We have cats around the house all the time. The kids bring them home. But none of them ever gave me an inferiority complex. Your kids never brought home a Siamese. You can stand it for 3 or 4 days. If it gets too much for you, we'll send a copy boy with a master's degree. He should be able to cope with a Siamese. Knock it off. Here comes Odd Bunsen, said Quillerin. Even before the photographer appeared, the cigar could be detected, and the voice could be heard, complaining about the frigid temperature outside. Odd tapped Quillerin on the shoulder. Are those cat hairs on your lapel? Or have you been dating a blonde with a crew cut? Quillerin combed his mustache with a swizzle stick. Odd said, I'm still on nights. Any of you guys want to eat with me? I've got an hour for dinner, if nobody blows up City Hall. I'll eat with you, said Quillerin. They found a table and consulted the menu. Odd ordered Salisbury steak, complimented the waitress on the trimness of her waistline, and then said to Quillerin, Well, have you got old Monty figured out yet? If I went around insulting everybody the way he does, I'd get fired. Or assigned to society, what's worse. How does he get away with it? Critic's license. Besides, newspapers like controversial writers. And where does he get all his money? I hear he lives pretty well. Travels a lot, drives an expensive car. He doesn't do that on what the Flux pays him. Mount Clemens doesn't drive, Quillerin said. Sure he does. I've seen him behind the wheel. I saw him this morning. He told me he didn't have a car. He rides taxis. Maybe he doesn't own one, but he drives one sometimes. How do you suppose he manages? No sweat. Automatic transmission. Didn't you ever do any one-arm driving? You must be a lousy lover. I used to drive with one arm, shift gears, and eat a hot dog all at the same time. I've got a few questions, too, Quillerin said. Are the local artists as bad as Mount Clemens says? Or is he as phony as the artists think? Mount Clemens says Hallipe is a charlatan. Hallipe says Zoe Lambreth's paintings are a hoax. Zoe says Sandy Hallipe is uninformed. Sandy says Mount Clemens is irresponsible. Mount Clemens says Farhar is incompetent. Farhar says Mount Clemens knows nothing about art. Mount Clemens says Earl Lambreth is pathetic. Lambreth says Mount Clemens is a monument of taste, truth, and integrity. So, who's on first? Listen, said Odd. I think they're paging me. The voice mumbling over the public address system could hardly be heard above the hubbub in the bar. "Yep, that's for me," the photographer said. "Somebody must have blown up the city hall." He went to the telephone, and Quillerin pondered the complexities of the art beat. When Odd Bunsen returned from the telephone booth, he was taut with excitement. Quillerin thought, a press photographer for 15 years, and he still lights up when there's a 3-alarm fire? "I've got news for you," said Odd, leaning over the table and keeping his voice down. "What is it?" "Trouble on your beat." "What kind of trouble?" "Homicide. I'm on my way to the Lambeth Gallery." "The Lambeth?" Quillerin stood up fast enough to knock over his chair. "Who is it? Not Zoe?" "No, her husband." "No, what happened?" "They said he was stabbed. Want to come with me? I told the desk you were here, and they said it would be good if you could cover it. Kendall's out on a story, and both Legmen are busy." "Okay, I'll go." "Better phone them back and say so. I've got my car outside." When Quillerin and Bunsen arrived in front of the Lambeth Gallery, there was an unwarranted calm in the street. The financial district was normally deserted after 5:30, and even a murder had failed to draw much of a crowd. A sharp wind whipped down the canyon created by nearby office buildings, and only a few shivering stragglers stood about on the sidewalk, but they soon moved on. A loneliness filled the street. Isolated voices sounded unreasonably loud. The newsmen identified themselves to the patrolman at the door. Inside, the expensive art and plush furnishings made an unlikely background for the assortment of uninvited guests. A police photographer was taking pictures of some paintings that had been viciously slashed. Bunsen pointed out the prescient inspector and Hames, a detective from the Homicide Bureau. Hames nodded at them and jerked a thumb upstairs. The newsman started up the spiral staircase at the rear, and then backed away to let a fingerprint man come down. He was talking to himself. He was saying, "How can they get a stretcher down this thing? They'll have to take him out the window." Upstairs, a sharp voice was saying, "Come on, you fellows. You can take care of that downstairs. Let's thin out." "That's Wojcik from Homicide," said Bunsen. "No fooling around with him." The framing shop was approximately as Quillerin remembered it, except for the men with badges, cameras, and notebooks. A patrolman stood in the doorway to Lambert's office, facing out. Over his shoulder, Quillerin could see that the office had been fairly well wrecked. The body lay on the floor near the desk. He got Wojcik's attention and flipped open a small notebook. "Murderer known?" "No," said the detective. "Victim Earl Lambeth, director of the gallery?" "Right." "Method?" "Stabbed with a tool from the workbench, a sharp chisel." "Where?" "Throat, a very wet job." "Body discovered where?" "In his office." "By whom?" "Victim's wife, Zoe." Quillerin took a second to gulp and grimace. "That's spelled Zoe, said the detective. "I know." "Any sign of a struggle?" "Office practically turned upside down." "What about the vandalism in the gallery?" "Several pictures damaged, a statue broken. You can see that downstairs." "What time did it happen?" "The electric clock knocked off the desk, stopped at 6:15. "The gallery was closed at that time." "Right." "Any evidence of forcible breaking and entering?" "No." "Then the murderer could have been someone who had legitimate access to the place." "Could be. We found the front door locked. The alley door may or may not have been locked when Mrs. Lambeth arrived." "Anything stolen?" "Not immediately apparent." Wojcik started to move away. "That's all. You've got the story." "One more question. Any suspects? No. Downstairs, while Bunsen scrambled around taking pictures, Quillerin studied the nature of the vandalism. 2 oil paintings had been ripped diagonally by a sharp instrument. A framed picture lay on the floor with its glass broken, as if a heel had been put through it. A reddish clay sculpture appeared to have been bounced off a marble-top table. There were scattered fragments. Paintings by Zoe Lambreth and Scrano, the only 2 names that registered with Quillerin, were unharmed. He remembered the sculpture from his previous visit. The elongated shape with random swellings had apparently been a woman's figure. Its label, still affixed to the empty pedestal, said, Eve by B.H. Riggs, terracotta. The watercolor on the floor was one Quillerin had not noticed the week before. It resembled a jigsaw puzzle of many colors, just a pleasing pattern. It was titled Interior, and the artist's name was Mary Orr. The label called it a gouache. Then, Quillerin examined the 2 oils. Both were composed of wavy, vertical stripes of color, applied on a white background with a wide brush. The colors were violent: red, purple, orange, pink, and the paintings seemed to vibrate like a plucked string. Quillerin wondered who would buy these nerve-wracking works of art. He preferred his second-rate Monet. Stepping closer to check the labels, he noted that one was Beach Scene No. 3 by Milton Orr, oil, while the other was Beach Scene No. 2 by the same artist. In a way, the titles were a help in appreciating the pictures. They began to remind Quillerin of shimmering heat waves rising from hot sand. He said to Bunsen, "Look at these 2 pictures. Would you say they were beach scenes?" "I'd say the artist was drunk," said Odd. Quillerin moved back a few paces and squinted at the 2 oils. Suddenly, he saw a crowd of standing figures. He had been looking at the red, orange, and purple stripes, and he should have been seeing the white voids between them. The vertical stripes of white suggested the contours of female bodies, abstract but recognizable. He thought, women's figures in those white stripes, a woman's torso in the broken clay. Let's have another look at the watercolor. When he knew what he was searching for, it was not hard to find. In the jagged wedges of color that made up the pattern of Mary Orr's work, he could distinguish a window, a chair, a bed, on which reclined a human figure. Female. He said to Odd Bunsen, "I'd like to go out to the Lambreth house and see if Zoe will talk to me. Also, she might have a photograph of the deceased. Shall we check with the desk?" After phoning the details to a rewrite man and getting a go-ahead from the city desk, Quillerin folded himself into Odd Bunsen's cramped 2-seater, and they drove to 3434 Sampler Street. The Lambreth home was a contemporary townhouse in a new neighborhood, self-consciously well-designed, that had replaced a former slum. The newsmen rang the doorbell and waited. Draperies were drawn to cover the large windows, but it could be seen that lights were burning in every room, upstairs and downstairs. They rang the bell again. When the door opened, the trousered woman who stood there, arms folded belligerently, feet planted solidly on the threshold, looked familiar to Quillerin. She was tall and husky. Her soft face was set in a stern expression. "Yes," she said defiantly. "I am a friend of Mrs. Lambreth," said Quillerin. "I wonder if I could see her and offer my assistance. Jim Quillerin's the name. This is Mr. Bunsen." "You're from the paper?" She's not going to see any reporters tonight. This isn't an official visit. We were on our way home and thought there might be something we could do. Aren't you Miss Bolton? Inside the house, a low, tired voice called, "Who is it, Butchie?" "Quillerin and another man from the Fluxion." "It's all right. Ask them in." The newsmen stepped into a room furnished in stark contemporary style. The furnishings were few, but fine. And there, leaning against a door jamb, was Zoe Lambreth, wearing purple silk trousers and a lavender blouse, and looking gaunt and bewildered. But she said, "She should be lying down and resting." Zoe said, "I'm all right. I'm too keyed up to do any resting." "She wouldn't take a sedative." "Will you gentlemen sit down?" Zoe said. Quillerin's face reflected the sympathetic understanding for which he was famous. Even his mustache contributed to the expression of grave concern. He said, "I don't need to tell you my feelings. Even though our acquaintance was short, I feel a personal loss." "It's terrible. Just terrible." Zoe sat on the extreme edge of the sofa, with her hands folded on her knees. "I visited the gallery last week, as you suggested." "I know. Earl told me." It's impossible to imagine what a shock this must have been. Butchie interrupted. "I don't think she should be talking about it." "Butchie, I've got to talk about it," said Zoe, "or I'll go crazy." She looked at Quillerin with the full brown eyes that he remembered so well from their first meeting. And now they reminded him of the eyes in Zoe's own paintings at the gallery. He said, "Was it your custom to go to the gallery after it was closed?" "Quite the contrary. I seldom went there at any time. It looks unprofessional for an artist to hang around the gallery that handles her work, especially in our case, husband and wife. It would look too folksy." "The gallery impressed me as very sophisticated," Quillerin said. "Very suitable for the financial district." Butchie said, with a frank show of pride, "That was Zoe's idea." "Mrs. Lambreth, what caused you to go to the gallery tonight?" "I was there twice. The first time was just before closing time. I had been shopping all afternoon, and stopped in to see if Earl wanted to stay downtown for dinner. He said he couldn't leave until 7 o'clock or later." "What time was it when you were talking to him?" "The front door was still open, so it must have been before 5:30. "Did he explain why he couldn't leave the gallery?" "He had to work on the books for a tax deadline or something, so I went home. But I was tired and didn't feel like cooking." Butchie said, "She's been working night and day, getting ready for a one-man show." "So I decided to have a bath and change clothes," Zoe went on, "and go back downtown at 7 o'clock and drag Earl away from his books." "Did you telephone him to say you were returning to the gallery?" "I think so, or maybe I didn't. I can't remember. I thought about phoning, but in the rush of getting dressed, I don't know whether I called or not. You know how it is. You do things automatically, without thinking. Sometimes I can't remember whether I've brushed my teeth, and I have to look at the toothbrush to see if it's wet." "When did you arrive at the gallery the second time?" "Just about 7 o'clock, I think. Earl had taken the car in for repairs, so I called a taxi and had the driver take me to the alley entrance of the gallery. I have a key for the back door, just in case of emergency." "It was locked?" "That's another thing I don't remember. It should have been locked. I put my key in the lock and turned the door handle without thinking much about it. The door opened and I went in." "Did you notice anything amiss on the ground floor?" "No. The lights were out, I went right up the spiral staircase. As soon as I walked into the workroom, I sensed something wrong. It was deadly quiet. I was almost afraid to go into the office. She was remembering it painfully. But I did. First I saw papers and everything all over the floor. And then she put her face in her hands, and there was silence in the room. After a while, Quillerin said gently, "Would you like me to notify Mount Clemens in New York? I know he thought highly of you both." "If you wish." "Have the funeral plans been made?" Butchie said, "There won't be a funeral. Zoe doesn't approve of funerals." Quillerin stood up. "We'll be going now, but please let me know, Mrs. Lambert, if there's anything I can do. Sometimes it helps just to talk." Butchie said, "I'm here. I'm looking after her." Quillerin thought the woman sounded possessive. He said, "Just one more thing, Mrs. Lambert. Do you have a good photograph of your husband?" "No, just a portrait I painted last year. It's in my studio. Butchie will show you. I think I'll go upstairs." She walked from the room without further ceremony, and Butchie led the newsmen to the studio at the rear of the house. There on the wall was Earl Lambert, cold, haughty, supercilious, painted without love. "Perfect likeness," said Butchie with pride. "She really captured his personality." Almost inaudible was the click of Odd Bunson's camera.